I wrote my book for the same reason that I decided after serving 25 years as managing editor of the Philadelphia Inquirer that I would go to Penn State to teach a new generation of journalists. I wanted to give them the benefit of what I had learned. And so I've written this book, The Ethical Journalist, as a sort of summing up of the life lessons. I'm trying to give college students an overview of the ethical issues that they will face in their own careers. I've found, like everybody else here, that we've learned from our successes and also from our failures. And what I was hoping to do with this book is to help them skip some of those tough struggles of trial and error by absorbing the lessons that my generation of journalists has learned through experience. Unlike several other textbooks on journalism ethics, mine emphatically states what the consensus guidelines of the profession are. As a sample, here's one of those guidelines, and I want to quote, "To guard against perception of bias in their reporting, journalists should scrupulously avoid making public comments about controversial public issues." Now, more about that particular example in a minute. For now, I'd just like to read this excerpt from the book's preface that explains my reasoning. Throughout the book, this is quoted, throughout the book, the consensus guidelines are explained not to dictate your decisions, but to offer a starting point for thinking through the issues. The idea is that you don't have to start with a blank canvas. You can build on the best thinking of your predecessors. And while there is disagreement in the profession, I will note that as well. All this I want to be fodder for classroom discussion. So what we're trying to do in this book, or I'm trying, is to not only teach the journalists, the aspiring journalists, to be autonomous moral agents, that is, people capable of making thoughtful decisions, but also trying to give them a head start so that they can be part of the way along that process by examining what we have done. And beyond that, my book is intended as a comprehensive examination of ethical issues about journalism that we're facing here in the 21st century, and that it ranges from conflict of interest to source relationships to privacy. In addition to drawing on my own experience and on the experience of about 100 other journalists that I interviewed in my research phase, my book reflects the thinking of scholars in the field as well. I think that we journalists do owe the Academy a thanks for having thought through a lot of the issues while we were concentrating on getting out the next day's paper, or if you're broadcast, the next newscast. So what I'd like to do now is to talk about two sets of ethical issues that I see that we're dealing with here in the age of cyberspace. The first set of issues has to do with the painful economics of the news media business today. Like any other business, news organizations have struggled with an abysmal economy in the last 2 years. But unlike many other businesses, the news business was already facing a crisis. And that crisis occurred as the audience migrated to online news sites, but the advertising dollars did not follow. For confirmation of this continuing migration of our users to the web, I cite the surveys that the Pew Research Center for People in the Press have done each year for some time. And they noted in December 2008, statistically, that for the first time, more people were getting national and international news on the web than in newspapers. The trend in these surveys is clear, even though newspapers continue to be preferred over the web for local news, and even though television, for now, continues to lead all media as sources of news of all kinds. That trend shows the internet growing as a news source from year to year in their surveys, while broadcasts and newspapers are declining. The traditional model of business for news organizations has not worked on the internet. In that traditional model, news coverage attracts an audience, and this audience is then rented out to advertisers. But on the web, rather than drawing the audience to advertising, news often gets in the way of the readers who are trying to find something to buy. An example of that is the efficient way that people find cars that they might want to buy, used cars, or jobs they might want to apply for, or houses or apartments they want to buy or rent. These used to be the most lucrative of areas of advertising revenue for newspapers, but now they go to sites like Monster.com and Realtor.com. Newspapers have long had the largest news staffs of any news medium in their respective communities, larger than broadcast stations and certainly larger today than news websites. In fact, most of the news coverage that appears on the web today was generated by newspaper reporters or by the Associated Press, which is owned by the newspapers. And now there are fewer newspaper journalists. This is statistically valid. The American Society of News Editors, which met earlier this week in Washington, does an annual survey since 1978 on newsroom census. And it was started in '78 to try to track our progress in achieving minority representation on our staffs, and it's done that. But it also calculates the number of journalists total in the newsroom. And that total in the last 3 years has gone down by 13,500 jobs. And so if newspapers vanish or dwindle to the point of ineffectiveness, the question is who, if anybody, will do the in-depth reporting that newspapers have traditionally done? And that's something I think that is a concern of everybody. So why is this an ethical issue? Because news organizations have a social responsibility to provide reliable information that you can use in the community to make governing decisions. And if we lack the resources, whether we're reporting on the web or on broadcast or in print, if we lack the resources to do that kind of job, to produce the kind of journalism that we're used to, then we are not able to fulfill that social responsibility. So this is really a responsibility that the community shares. It is everybody's interest that we somehow find a business model that will sustain news staffs of quantity and quality. It is hard to imagine a community without access to news gathered by a professional news staff. The traditional media, newspapers and broadcasts made the right decision, in my opinion, a decade and a half ago when news on the internet became a practical matter. They moved immediately to establish websites. But there now is a growing realization that news cannot continue to be offered for free as most websites are doing. News, of course, is not free. It is quite expensive to gather. And if advertisers are not going to pay for news on the web, then it is quite likely that websites will be asking the users to do so. Obviously, people who have been used to getting the news free are not going to be happy about paying for it. And there's also the competitive situation that if I start charging for my website and a competitor doesn't charge, I will have ceded, at least for the time being, a competitive advantage. Now, this is a quandary about whether the people will move on to the free websites. It's something that I think that Walter Hussman of the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette did foresee years ago, that he's one of the few publishers today who, from the beginning, limited access on the paper's site to subscribers of the print newspaper. And while it may be an inconvenience, some of us who would like to surf to the Democrat-Gazette and get free, from an economic standpoint, it appears that that is going to be the way of the future. A related ethical issue arises from new industry economics, and several newspapers are experimenting with ethically questionable strategies. Some of those are mentioned in my textbook, and these include features in the newspapers that are sponsored by individual advertisers. For example, a daily business column that is wrapped in an advertisement for a bank, which might well be a subject of coverage in that business column. In another example is a television practice of interviewing advertisers on shows that appear to be information or public service. In the case of the sponsored column, readers might assume, right or wrong, that the bank that sponsors the column is going to get favored treatment in the news. And in the case of the paid TV interview, viewers are misled because they don't understand that they're seeing an advertisement. Now in a survey just recently by the Project for Excellence in Journalism, some television news executives mentioned several other disturbing trends. One of those was having product placement in video for news stories. Another, having news anchors read the advertising message, which blurs the line between when they're delivering news and when they're helping an advertiser. And placing the news department, in one case, was under the direction of the sales director. All of these developments reflect unacceptable advertiser influence on news coverage. I'd like to move now, though, from the second set of ethical issues that I see in today's environment, moving from economics to whether the news is increasingly being delivered on the web, and whether, as we do that, our time-honored standards of journalism ethics will continue to apply in this new medium. And it is still new. It's in its adolescence, even though a lot of people today that I see in their classes have grown up with that. But the mid-90s is where we started. So we're still trying to figure that out. But what has happened so far, I fear that these standards are not going to be followed, or that they're not now. Journalists share cyberspace with the citizen bloggers, and they simultaneously denounce the mainstream media, or MSM, while helping themselves to the news that these journalists have gathered at great expense and often with physical risk. A few citizen blogs have solid reporting, but for the most part, blogs are like talk television or talk radio, in which they offer commentary but not much new information. For their part, the mainstream media are shifting dangerously from the principles of the profession. Our historical model of journalism is verify it and be impartial. In other words, get the facts right and don't reveal your biases. I'm disturbed about what is happening on websites of some mainstream media organizations. And these are some of the trends. One, that a mindset of post it now and correct it later. And that results in the dissemination of flawed information to the public. Another is unfiltered user posts that harm the subjects of news coverage and subject the public to comments that are vulgar, mean-spirited, and misinformed. Blogging is the use of the use of the social media by journalists that exposes their opinions of the people and events that they cover, which in turn diminishes their effectiveness as impartial observers. Now, I'd like to elaborate on those three topics, and then I'll invite your questions. The first question I would ask, in a medium built on speed, will journalism standards of verification be maintained? A variety of factors combine to pose a threat to the tradition of checking and rechecking that quality journalism requires. News sites have been thinly staffed, and it is easy to update and correct information on the internet. So the temptation is to get ahead of the competition by posting something and then correcting it on the fly. Now, this ignores the harm that can be done by faulty reports, even if they're corrected, because not everybody will see the corrected version, and even the earlier flawed version will linger on the internet in some form. The question of verification becomes more important if, as it seems likely, the internet will replace newspapers and broadcasts as a dominant news medium. when the new website is the mothership. The question is, will its bosses suddenly allocate the resources needed for this level of checking and rechecking? Unfortunately, contemporary news media history suggests the opposite. If a website has succeeded without spending the money on dollars on editing, then there is no financial incentive to change. And thus, the decisions about ethical standards on the web are often being made by default in this transition phase. If economics dictate a skimpy staff, then the editing will be skimpy. And the long-term quality of internet reporting is being shaped in this transition period by the decisions that are made or not made in today's environment. And I fear that some of the people who are making or not making those decisions are not aware that they're setting the template for the future of journalism. I was stunned to read in the Professional Journal a year or so ago an article recommending that we can safely reduce the number of editors on our website because if we get something wrong, the readers will call in and correct us. This actually appeared. Yes, mistakes do happen even when the best journalistic techniques are followed. And it is a breakthrough to be able to correct them today rather than waiting for the next newscast or waiting, in our case, as newspaper journalists, for the next day's paper. But I think it's irresponsible to suggest that this justifies disseminating information that we're not sure, to the best of our knowledge, is accurate. And it's encouraging to know that many news executives who might be able to do something about that share this concern about accuracy in web reporting. In the recent survey, the Project for Excellence in Journalism reports that these executives show a majority of those worrying about whether the internet has changed the fundamental values of journalism. Their biggest concern, like mine, is that loosening standards of accuracy and verification in the rush to post the news. So that's one problem. The second one is the medium, in a medium built for interactivity, can civility be protected? For many news consumers, one of the attractions of reading news on the web is that they can instantly and usually anonymously post comments reacting to what they have read. The problem is that the conversation abounds with downright meanness. Very few news sites review user comments before they are posted. What they do instead is to post their rules of behavior and invite the public to call them or email them if they see somebody who is not observing, and then they will take a look at it. In my opinion, that's not enough. Now here's a paradox I'd like you to think about, that in a typical newspaper, which has a website, and all of them do, in the printed paper, they have a letters to the editor column. People are not allowed to write anonymously. If you write one anonymously, they usually won't run it. If you post your name there, they'll probably call you, as they should, to verify that you actually were the one who sent the letter in. The letter writers are not allowed to misstate the facts. They're not allowed to make personal attacks. They're not allowed to use foul language. But on the web, the same news organization might permit all of those things. I asked why the difference. Well, what I hear is that first, the news site has no choice but to allow user comments online. Otherwise, the people who want to post will go somewhere else. So traffic will diminish. Second, the sheer volume of comments makes the prior review impractical. USA Today, for example, gets 10,000 comments a day. I must say that I'm not convinced, though. The New York Times resisted allowing comments for a long time, and when it started doing it a year or so ago, it became one of the few organizations that conducts a prior review. It should come no surprise that some people objected to that prior review. One wrote to the public editor of the Times to complain and said, and this is quote, "Mandating tepid civility in blog comments has an ideological component. Politeness bars sharply worded disagreement by dissenters against those who claim to be the authority, but it doesn't usually bar dismissing or patronizing comments by the authorities against the dissenters." Now, the profession should attach a high priority to figuring out how to moderate this internet conversation. And I'm glad to say that some news organizations are trying to deal with that problem. One example of that is the Washington Post. Its ombudsman recently reported, this is Andrew Alexander, that commenters in the plan that they're considering commenters will be grouped into two different tiers. There is one tier called trusted commenters. These are people who have commented and acted responsibly in the past or who sign their names. And then the second tier are those who are discourteous. They're either put on this second tier, or in some cases, repeated violations are barred outright, as indeed they are today. But you will be classified if you write a comment to the Post under this plan by having someone read your comment the first time and put you in what is deemed to be the appropriate tier. In the future, then, when visitors click on stored comments, they see only those from the trusted group. Now, if they want to see the inflammatory comments from the so-called trolls, then they will need to click on a second icon and access this second-class tier. Now, Andy Alexander, the public editor who wrote about this, says he likes this approach because it doesn't limit speech. Anonymous loudmouths can still be heard, but the trusted commenters will be easier to read. So we will see how that works out. As for allowing anonymous comments, I stand with Miami Herald stellar columnist Leonard Pitts Jr., who wrote recently that online message boards have become, and this is, have, in quote, inadvertently licensed and tacitly approved the worst of human nature under the guise of free speech. And he wrote, quote, enough, make them leave their names, stop giving people a way to throw rocks and then hide their hands. Any drop-off in the quantity of message postings will surely be made up in the quality thereof. Now, my third question about the internet and ethics today is how can mainstream journalists take advantage of the benefits of blogging and social networking while still preserving their hard-earned reputation for fairness? Encouraged by their bosses, a lot of journalists of mainstream organizations have been flocking to the web, and they write online journals or blogs to expand their reporting and to invite a conversation with the audience. They emulate the success of the best citizen bloggers and by adopting a more relaxed, and some would say snarky, style of writing. Unlike the citizen bloggers, though, our mainstream journalists have a responsibility. They should not express opinions about the people and events they cover, because those opinions would color the way that the audience perceives them and would diminish their credibility. The principle is expressed in the policy statement of the Washington Post, which says, quote, reporters and editors should not express personal opinions in blogs unless they would be allowed in the print newspaper to express opinions. In other words, if you're a columnist, you can express opinions in your blog. But if you're reporting straight in the newspaper, you ought to not reveal your personal opinions in the blog either. And here we have another paradox. When a newspaper writes a just the facts, straight-ahead news story for the print edition, the copy may be reviewed by 3 or more editors, and they're checking for factual accuracy, they're checking for quality of prose, spelling and grammar correctness, inadvertent expressions of bias. Yet, when the same reporter writes a blog, which by definition in today's environment is risk-taking, cutting edge, the reporter quite likely posts it directly to the internet without any editor intervention. Now, these are the reasons that editors most frequently give me for posting blogs first and then editing later, if at all. They say editing detracts from the spontaneity of the blog. And one blogger actually said to me that editors would beat the life out of them if they got a hold of them. Which makes you wonder why they're allowed to edit for the newspaper. Writers are encouraged to blog at all times of the day, and editors might not be available. And there is a bottleneck as blogs await editing. They want to get them on the web fast. And bloggers know the guidelines and can be trusted to follow them. And once again, I'm not convinced. I say that no matter how good and how experienced a journalist may be, the journalist is taking a risk by venturing onto the high wire without the safety net of an editor's scrutiny. I think blogging by mainstream journalists is a good idea, as long as the journalists don't neglect their primary reporting duty and as long as they maintain their neutrality and appearance of neutrality on all media platforms. The best way to achieve those goals, I would submit, is to edit blogs to the exacting standards of traditional journalism. A related issue is how news journalists should behave on Facebook and Twitter. Specifically, should they express their personal points of view on issues of the news? Should they become a Facebook friend of a news subject or a fan of someone they cover? Many news organizations, in my opinion, are answering that question simply and emphatically by saying no. They're putting conduct guidelines into place to make it clear that no matter what the venue, journalists simply should not express their views publicly on controversial issues. For reasons I can't fathom, this is becoming a controversy. Some very smart people are saying things like this: the day of preventing journalists from expressing opinions are gone. That's impossible to do if you want to live on the web, and of course, we've got to live on the web. But I thought it was settled long ago that journalists made a choice. If they're going to report the news, they can't be players in the news. We may have a wondrous new method of communicating instantaneously, and it changes a lot in our profession, but it should not change our commitment to the ethical principle of neutrality in reporting, both real and perceived. We keep our opinions to ourselves. To reveal those opinions is to invite the audience to find bias in stories that do not contain bias. I'd like you, in closing, to consider this analogy. A football referee, now imagine this, calls a news conference before the game and says, I'm going to call this game fair and square, but I'm telling you, Team A is the best team on the field today, all right? But late in the game, a close play tilts the game, Team A wins. Now, if you're a fan of Team B, would you think you were robbed? All right? So is it any wonder that referees keep their opinions to themselves? And shouldn't journalists, we wear the striped shirts in the news arena, shouldn't we adhere to the same common sense rule? I might add that as a football fan, I don't care who the referee thinks is the best team. I want the referee to call it fair. And I would submit that if reporters deliver honest news, then their opinions are just as irrelevant. So I'd now like to invite your questions. Yes, okay, thank you.
All right, let me moderate the questions here. Yes, sir, right here. Please wait for the microphone.
In Hot Springs, the newspaper prints every day a little disclaimer. It isn't too little, it's easily read, saying we aren't going to print news stories about businesses unless they advertise in our paper. Does that obviate the problem of paying for news?
We have to separate news and advertising, and if a non-advertiser makes news good or bad, or an advertiser makes news bad, we should do our jobs. And I can't, this is stating a principle that I can't agree with.
Mr. Sells?
I'd like to have your personal take on the lack of ethics in two of our national television networks and the effect they might be having on the thought processes of America. And I'm talking about Fox News and MSNBC News, neither of which could ever claim to be journalistically ethical.
Yeah, I think that particularly Fox has found a niche, and I don't say that it's not accurate or they don't, but they certainly are catering to a certain audience. And I recall somebody quipping one time that the leading, all the networks, of course, broadcast Republican National Convention, but Fox had the highest viewer, and somebody said, well, don't you want the home team announcers? So I think that's what they're doing. But I think that they at least try to report the news accurately, but definitely, I think you're colored, though, also by their talk shows and how they're tilted, which are unabashed commentary.
Further questions? Yes, ma'am. He's getting my...
I'm quite concerned that journalism, as we know it, is quite ill. And I'm incensed that reporters think that we don't have the reasoning process that we need to make decisions on our own as readers. What is being done to keep journalism as we know it alive? And I know you're working on it, but I want to know what we can expect.
Would you be referring to the economic situation with fewer reporters or fewer resources, or are you talking about the commentary?
That is used in reporting.
I think that that a lot of people see bias in the news that may or may not be there, but there is a problem when we try to do analysis, that it's easy to venture over the line or be perceived as venturing over the line as we try to interpret and give context to the news, which I think is a valid thing to do. But I can't tell you how many people from the Pine Bluff Commercial to the Philadelphia Inquirer calling in say, keep your opinions on the editorial page. They accept that we ought to have an editorial page, but we've always been accused of bias, and we're not perfect, but I do think that journalists, by and large, buy into and practice the idea that we have opinions, but we filter them out, and it's a measure of our professionalism. But as I say, analysis, trying to be analytic, often it can put us over the line in terms of what could be perceived as bias.
Any additional questions? Yes, sir, right here.
Yes, sir. I'd like your thoughts on particularly the economic situation as money gets tighter. My concern is the sort of like, I don't like to call it the corporatization of news, where large corporations own large news organizations, and your thoughts on how much that influences what gets reported or how it gets reported as news.
Well, I think that I've worked for a corporation that owned the Philadelphia Inquirer, Knight Ridder. It was a good organization in terms of its standards of journalism. I have seen local owners who were not good, and I think that it depends on who it is, whether it's a corporation or whether it's a hometown owner. And in my book, I discussed that. One of the I spotted in chapter 3 of my book about the history of development of ethics in journalism. There was a period between the mid-70s to the mid-80s in which journalists really got religion about ethics and trying to show that they were free of conflicts of interest. I asked a number of people about reasons for that, and one of the reasons they gave was chain ownership. Chain ownership can be good or bad, as I just tried to say, but that it did, in many cases, bring to a place a level of professionalism that had not existed before. An example of that was Lexington, Kentucky. In the civil rights era in the mid-60s, under private ownership, they refused to cover civil rights demonstrations. They did not report on something that was changing the fabric of the community. Later, under Knight Ridder ownership, the combined newspapers reported courageously on cash payments to University of Kentucky basketball players, a scandal. It's just different approaches there. That is, that whether it's local or chain, it's going to vary one way or the other. But I think the important thing is to try to get people who own papers to understand and what is important about good journalism and how to keep it going in this very perilous times as we're trying to figure out how to make the web pay off so that we can afford to pay our readers, pay our reporters and editors.
And one right here.
Said that approximately 95% of all of the reporters are Democratic instead of Republican. Obviously, there's a lot of Democrats, but that is not representative across the board. Is there some way that you can address the fact that people who have more conservative tendencies are discouraged from actually going into reporting because of a hostile work environment?
People with more reporters are Democrats than Republicans. 95-5 was the number she used, percentage. And people are discouraged from going into reporting because of their conservative views in a different environment.
Well, I don't, I've interviewed a lot of journalists for jobs in the newsroom, and I've never asked them, nor have they volunteered what their opinion is. I think that that they are attracted, as I would be, to a newspaper that stands up for what they believe right from an editorial standpoint. And I have always worked for newspapers although I never, got involved in the editorials myself, I was pleased with the editorial positions. But my mission and the people in the newsrooms is that they have a professional responsibility. Whatever their opinions are is to filter them out and report the news straight. So I think that we're trying to do our best to do that. Some people succeed better than others, but by and large, I think that the journalists in the United States do adhere to that guideline, and it would be a professional embarrassment to them if their peers saw them as blatantly putting or deliberately putting their views in the paper.